Hello, my name's Alex Hoffman, and this is Angular and Introduction. This talk is focused on new Angular developers or developers who don't know Angular and want to hear a little bit about what it's all about and what makes it a good framework. We'll be talking some about the history of Angular. We'll be talking about individual parts that make Angular great, and we'll also be demoing some of those aspects, as well as talking about how it stacks up against other frameworks. So, with that in mind, let's dive in. So, Angular was started in 2010 by Misko Hevry, an employee at Google at the time. At the time, he was working on a few JavaScript projects, and he developed Angular as a way to help him with the projects he was working on internally. It gained popularity and was actually released publicly, and a team was built up around it, and it became a framework of its own, a public framework of its own. In 2014, the team who had been built up around Angular realized that it was falling behind other frameworks, primarily React. In the biggest way it was falling behind React was that it just couldn't keep up with speed due to a lot of the forced two-way binding that Angular contained, so the team decided they needed to do a full rewrite of it. The rewrite concluded in 2016 when the team released Angular 2. This was also the period where they split Angular and AngularJS. AngularJS referring to everything in the Angular 1 and Angular 1 Plus lifecycle, while Angular referred to everything at Angular 2 onwards, all the way up to Angular 7, which is now released. So everything that refers to Angular is Angular 2 Plus, and everything before that is AngularJS. And in 2017, the team released Angular 4, which they skipped Angular 3 because there were some issues developing the router for Angular 3, and they basically realized it was no good, so they skipped straight to Angular 4. At this point, they also announced a LTS, or long-term support, for AngularJS and Angular. AngularJS will be supported until 2021, and Angular will get new releases that will continue to be supported for a long time. So that's a great thing to know, because when you choose Angular, you know you're getting frameworks that will be around and supported for quite a while. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Angular CLI. The Angular CLI is a command line interface which allows for complex tasks to be automated with simple commands. Some things you can do that we'll look at are project generation, running a project, generating and scaffolding schematics, which are your components, your services, your models, and everything that you can need. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a new project here, and it will be generated by the Angular CLI completely for us. This is going to take a few minutes. As it generates up, it's going to create all the files we need, as well as do a npm install for us to install Angular and all of its supporting basic libraries. Great thing about Angular is that, or a great thing for some people about Angular is that it all comes, a lot of what you need to develop comes out of box. I really like that. It makes prototyping and getting projects started quick and easy. That's not always the case with some other front-end frameworks, but it's something that I personally really enjoy. So now that everything is installed, we can go ahead and jump into that project. And we call the project Angular Intro Live. So we're going to open that in the editor. So here you can see that we've got all of our files generated for us, all of our configurations, the entire project is set up for us. So if we open up our terminal, we can now go ahead and run ngserve, which is another CLI command. The ngs are the commands for the code word for the CLI. And once this finishes building, we can see that we have a fully running Angular project. And that's all you need to know about Angular. So that's the end of the talk. All joking aside, it's really cool that that's really all you need to do to create a new project. So now that we've seen that the base project has been started up, what we can do is we can go ahead and make some edits to the project to see a little bit of the power of ngserve. So if we jump into our app file, we can go ahead and we'll make a few edits to it. So we're going to change the title to Welcome to the Jungle, and we've deleted some of the other info, and you can see that without us having to rebuild the project, it auto updates when we're using the ngserve command, so you don't have to worry about rebuilding a project every time you make a change. You can just go ahead and make your changes and immediately see whether you've had the anticipated results or not, which is very great and helpful for development, especially when you're working with some CSS stuff. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and use the CLI, another ng command, to generate a component for ourselves. And the component that we are going to generate, if I can spell component correctly, is our dashboard. So we're going to create our dashboard kind of to function as our main page for the demo. And there you can see it generated the dashboard component for us automatically, put it where it needed to be. It also placed it in our application everywhere, as well as gave us a CSS file, a HTML file, a component file, and a spec file. So those are the files that were created for us. So a few other things to know about the Angular CLI recently added was the ability to upgrade projects, which is very helpful. So if you're on a previous version of Angular and you know what version you're on, you can give the CLI the command to upgrade it to whatever version of Angular you want, and it will go through code the CLI has generated as well as code that the CLI didn't generate that you wrote yourself, and will make all those upgrades for you. Another thing that's cool is that you can use the CLI to introduce other tools not even developed by the Angular team in. For instance, we had a demo of Angular using Typescript for native apps last month, and we were able to add Typescript in automatically at the very beginning of that demo talk using the CLI. So that's a really cool. So there's some really cool features that have been added in and are good reasons to use Angular as well, even if they're not entry-level concepts. So next we're going to talk about routing. Routing is super easy with Angular. It's basically just mashing together a route and a component. So we're going to jump back into our demo and look at an example of that. So we've got our dashboard component. So we're going to start routing to our dashboard component. So we're going to grab a snippet, which allows us to import the routing module, as well as creating a route object. We're going to route to our dashboard component, which we created, and then all we have to do is import our routes into our router module, so the app knows to use that routes object for routing. And then we can go ahead and I believe the last thing we need to do is we need to enter a router outlet, which tells the app to direct that routing and place all that routing inside of this outlet component. So that tells it basically where to route to. Now if we go ahead and run ngserve, we should see a change in our app. We should be able to see that we are now routing to our dashboard component. And there we go. There we have dashboard works, which is the default. When you generate a component, it's going to just say that it works. But we are now routing to our dashboard component. We can also see that we can change the path to whatever we want. So for this, we'll go ahead and change the path to dashboard. And when we save that and we go to the dashboard route, we'll now see that we are now, after the change, we weren't routing to the dashboard, but now we're routing. We changed the route to include dashboard. We're now rerouting to our dashboard component. So a couple other things to mention about routing. Angular allows you to do sub-routing, which allows you to do multiple routes. You can route within a route. You can route within specific components. So you can load up a page and you can use routing, for instance, to choose which components show up where on the page. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with that. You can also use routing to do lazy loading, which basically allows for you to only load the pieces of the app that you know you'll need in that route, as opposed to loading the entire app itself. When you have large apps, this can really help with your loading time and a bunch of other performance optimizations. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is the component structure. What the component structure is basically a focus on breaking down functionality into small, reusable components. What this gives you is it allows you to avoid code duplication. It allows you to do a separation of concerns in terms of your logic, and it allows for readability and testability in your application. So if we come in, we're going to go ahead and generate a new component. We're going to call it the user component. We're going to, for our demo, we're going to be using users. We've created another component just like we did with the dashboard component. And now if we go into our dashboard HTML, instead of dashboard works, we can go ahead and put in one of those user components, and we will now go ahead and say we have a bunch of users, so we can put the user component in over and over again. And if we then go ahead and run that, we should see that we have a bunch of instances of the same user component. So instead of having to type out the user component as many different times as we need, we can just use the same the stuff in the user component as many times as we need. We can just use the user component multiple times, and there you see we have multiple users now. So we'll talk more about component structure and reusability, but we'll now move on to our next topic, which is TypeScript. So TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript that Angular is written in and uses. It allows for classes and interfaces to be implemented into your JavaScript code. It allows for optional static typing, and it allows for IntelliSense, or for your whatever you use to edit your code to know more about what should be in there and what properties you can use, what functions you can call on certain objects, and it's a super useful thing. So we'll take a look at that. Go back over into our test application, and we're going to go ahead and generate a user class. So by generating a user class, we can define what a user is going to look like, and we can use that in the rest of our application. So if we go through and get what I've predetermined the user is going to look like, so the user is going to have two properties, a name and an email, and they're both going to be strings. It allows us to do the typing, which is super helpful, and it also, in this user class, it allows us to create a constructor. So if we have a constructor and we expect to get in a name and an email, and we expect them both to be strings, and it will create a new user with the name and email that it has been given. So if we go into our dashboard, we can now put a list of users in. We need to just use our IDE to import the user object, and now we have a defined users in our dashboard component. And there you can see we're using the new user, the constructor, to create the users. It's one line. It's very simple. And here through IntelliSense, we can see that when we delete one of the imports, it's expecting two strings, so it knows that's wrong. Also, if we try and put in a mistyped argument like 2, which is a number instead of a string, IntelliSense hooked up to TypeScript, is able to say, hey, this isn't right, you can't do that. So this is especially helpful when you're working on teams with lots of people, where someone editing a piece of code isn't necessarily the person who wrote the piece of code and doesn't know what it was intended for it. Here's another example of us putting in a non-user into our array of users that also doesn't work. Basically, for team programming or programming where it's a long programming cycle, you're coming back and looking at code from 3 months ago, it helps maintain the code's structure and integrity, which is really neat. So here, if we take our app user and instead of just running it a bunch of times, we use a for loop, which allows us to run a bunch of users. And for user and user, we import a user. So basically, for that users list that we just created, each app user that we create is going to get one of those users. And then we go into user, and we have to let user know that we're trying to import that. So we give it a @input. That's the user, and we tell it that's a type user, so we can get the IntelliSense there. And then we just go in for the user HTML, and we give it. This is just some styling, but basically what it's going to do is display the username and the user email. So we're looping over the users list, and we're putting in a username and a user email, and we're displaying that for each user. So when this eventually builds and serves up, there we go. We're able to see for each user we have a component that's showing the user and the user's name and the user email. So, checking for IntelliSense, one more example of that is when we have our user, if we hit the dot, it tells us what fields are available because we know that's a user. So email and name are the only two properties on user, so that's what our options are. And also, if we try and type a property that isn't in user, IntelliSense is able to tell us, hey, that's not a thing you can do. So all of these can be lifesavers when you're coding, especially when you get onto bigger projects where a lot of stuff is going on. You're dealing with a bunch of objects that are maybe similar but different. It's all really helpful. A few other things to know about TypeScript is it compiles down into JavaScript. So when you build it, it actually turns it all into JavaScript, which allows it to run on a bunch of browsers. Also, React, the community has started moving towards using React with TypeScript, and Viewpoint 3.0, which is the other big framework, is being built. The new version is being built in TypeScript, so the entire JavaScript community seems to be heading towards using TypeScript, and Angular was really a little bit ahead of the curve here. So that's really cool. So the next thing we're going to talk about is Angular Material. Angular Material is a component library for Angular. Basically, comes with a ton of stylized components that you would need to build an app. The cool thing about Angular Material is that the Angular Material team works very closely with the Angular team. I believe they're in the same building. They sit just down the hall from each other, so the Angular material team is able to coordinate very well with the Angular team, and they release at the same time at the same version number. So every time there's an Angular release, there's an Angular material release to match it, and the Angular material is always up to date, and you can always use that. So again, it comes with a lot of stylized components that you would need to build an app. It can save a lot of time making your app look nice using material build. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at doing that. So here we're going to go through the stock on the Angular Material website steps for setting up Angular Material. We're going to run the npm install on the animations and the material library. We're going to import the matte button, which is what we're going to be using, as well as a browser animations module just to make the animations for the components work. And we just need to stick those things into our imports, and we're good to use Angular Material, or at least the Angular Material button. We've fully imported that. All those setup steps are just on the home website of Angular Material, so it's super easy. The last thing we need to do is we also need to import a theme that tells us basically what colors to use on our Angular material items. You can use one of the default themes, or you can use whatever colors you want. It's not difficult to set up your app to do that. So first thing, we're going to see a non-Angular material button. What that looks like, we're just going to stick a button in for add user. We're going to serve it back up, and we are going to take a look at what that looks like. So there we go, and there's a simple basic HTML add user button that looks pretty bad and old-fashioned. So now we're going to go in and see what happens when we do a Angular Material button. So here we're using matte raised button, which says I want a material button and I want it to be raised, and we have a color of primary, which is using that theming that we imported into our SCSS file. And we've got a nice button. We can also look at some of the components. We've got checkboxes, which are great. This is the Angular Material website, by the way. We can use date pickers, sliders. All of them are themed. All of them look really nice. All of them come with a decent amount of functionality that you would want to add to your app. Toolbars, basically everything that you could want. Not everything you want, but a lot of the components that you would want or need for a standard website are included here in the Angular Material library, and it's just as simple as adding them to your app. Next thing we're going to talk about is observables. Observables are a key part of Angular. What observables are is they're objects that you can monitor for changes, or observe for changes, as you would guess. Whoa, a lot of jumping around. Angular is built for observables. The Angular team built Angular with observables in mind, so they were ahead of the game on that as well. RxJS is the main library for JavaScript for using observables, and it's included in Angular by default. And the way that you would subscribe to observables is through subscriptions. So what we'll do in a second is we'll jump back into our sample app and take a look at how you might use observables. So here in our dashboard, besides just having users, we're going to create a user stream, which is going to be a subject, which is a type of observable, and it's going to be a subject of user. So it's going to be something that we can observe for a user. And got a small error here. Oh, yep, I was trying to type user stream as a subject when I really needed to say that user stream was a new subject. So we're going to put two functions into our dashboard. We're going to, in our ng on init, we're going to basically say that we are subscribing or watching our user stream for changes. And when the change happens on a user, we are going to push the user that comes in into our users list. Then in our add user function, we're going to, when the add user is called, we're going to take the user stream and we're going to set its new value using .next to a new user, and it's going to just use a function to find and create the new user, but it's just using our constructor, fairly simple. So also on our add user button, we're going to add a click function that calls the add user function. So now if we run that and go back into our app, oh, and here we accidentally, when we rebuilt, we navigated away from our dashboard to just our home, which is what's not showing up. So go back in, we put in dashboard, and that'll bring us back to our page. So here we go ahead, click add user, and there we go. We can see we immediately add a new user into our users list and display it. We can continue to do this as many times as we need to. Thought I did it another time, maybe I didn't. I might be getting asked a question crowd there. Yep, don't know what happened there, but anyway, so to show a little bit more of the power of observables, we're going to go ahead and instead of importing a user into our user component, we're going to import whatever's in the user stream. And because we're doing that, we don't want to loop through the users, so back to the user stream. And now every time we click add user, we can actually see what the last thing that went through our user stream is. So it was 3 when we clicked the first time, and every time we click it, it'll increase because it'll show us the new user. I believe we also go through and we just, for the users list, which is what all these users are getting at to, we add that in so we can see the count. So we start 2, so the count keeps on increasing for the number of users we have, but using the user stream, we can only show the most up-to-date user. You could see plenty of uses for this in apps as far as, oh, here's the last person who joined this chat room or whatnot. There are a lot of the getting the last thing. But that's just one of the many powers that, well, not powers, one of the great things you can get from observables and how powerful it is. We had a talk given last month, or not last month, a few months ago on observables and all about observables. You should go check that out. It's on our YouTube channel. Last thing to talk about in observables is functional programming. Functional programming is a really cool way of dealing with observables, where instead of using the subscribe to update the state of the app, you can do it, kind of make stateless changes to it. It also kind of helps with readability, and because of the way that it works, you're not storing as much, so it allows your app to run faster. There are a bunch of other great things about functional programming. If you want to dive more into that, I think you should, but that's more of a advanced topic and a little bit out of scope for this talk. So we're gonna skip it for now, except for just mentioning it and how cool it is. Next thing we're going to talk about is testing. So when we use the Angular CLI to generate a project and any of its components, you usually get a schematic, a testing framework for the generated schematic. Unit and integration tests in Angular are run using Karma, and that whole setup is basically given to you when you use the CLI to generate a project. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at that. So, first thing, we want to make sure that we go back into our component and we want to get it back to the state before we were looking at the user stream, or we're just looking at the users. And here I accidentally left my pipe in, even though I took out the async, so it took me a few seconds before someone was able to tell me what I had done wrong. And now we've got our app back to where it was. We can go ahead and, without having done anything, we can just run ng test, so our Angular CLI command, and just tell it to run the tests. And it will go ahead and it will run those tests for us. But because we haven't been keeping up with our tests since we started building the app, they should fail, which they do. So 5 auto-generated tests, and they all fail. Here is the Karma Live Debugger, which you also get, so you can actually go through and see each test, what's failing, what the errors are, and dive into that. That's super helpful for debugging and making your application work. So if we jump into our spec component for our dashboard, our spec file for our dashboard component, we can see here is the auto-generated testing framework. We didn't have to do anything with that. I happen to know that specifically these tests are failing because we are not including the user component, so we can just add that right in, and then our it should create test will now be passing. So you can see that out of 5, only 4 tests are passing. For the demo, we're just going to deal with the dashboard component instead of fixing everything. So if we just focus on the dashboard component by putting an F in front of the scribe, we can see that that one test is properly working. So now we can go ahead and create a new test. So if I go in and I grab the test that I wrote in advance, we have the id, and we describe it as user should be added when a user is clicked. Add user is clicked. So when we click the add user button, we should see a user added. My copy paste changed one of the quotes to something else, so fix that. So here we go ahead, save. We've got a working test, basically on a more line to line. Once again, we're saying what the definition of the test, we're reading it. So for readability, user should be added when add user clicked. Then the first line, we get the initial count of the users, so initial equals component.user. So component allows us to actually refer to the instance of the component that we're testing. Users is that user object, and we're just getting the length of that. So here we can see everything that we'd expect to be on the component. Our functions and our users and our user streams are all accessible through our component. We can use that same thing to do component and call the add user function instead of having to physically click the button. So that's how the test knows to add a user. And then we would expect the user's length to be what the initial length was, but with 1 added, so initial plus 1. And we can see that that test runs properly and passes. And we can now see in our Karma debugger, we can see our 2 tests and that they both passed. So that's a brief overview of testing. It's pretty simple, and I could talk forever about all the good reasons there are to test, but it comes easy and set up for you in Angular. Another thing is that end-to-end tests with Protractor are already set up for you using the Angular CLI. End-to-end tests are a little bit more difficult to write and run and keep up to date, but we'll show right here that using ng-ede, which is command to run end-to-end tests, you can already start running your end-to-end tests. Same as our unit tests, they're going to be broken because we haven't been keeping up with them. And again, a little bit more of an advanced topic, so not covered in this talk, but something to point out, and another great reason to use Angular, and a great thing that comes with the Angular CLI. So this test, the one test that's running, is expecting the text from the initial generation page, which we got rid of and changed to our own stuff, which is why it's failing. Again, wouldn't expect the end-to-end test to pass initially. So here we have kind of a chart comparing Angular to React to Vue, which for those of you who don't know are the 3 most popular front-end JavaScript frameworks nowadays. In terms of backers, Angular is backed by Google, React is backed by Facebook, and Vue is completely open source, developed by former Angular employees who left and decided to try and take the best of both Angular and React. Angular is super popular for enterprise development right now. React is very popular for jobs. This popularity is all based on Google Trends. As far as searching and instances of them online, you see similar amounts in Angular and React. Vue is, you see a lot less, but it's on the rise, and Vue is also has a very high popularity and ratings on GitHub for the framework as compared to other frameworks. Vue is the best rated of the frameworks. As far as the learning curves, Angular is the hardest, React is easier, and Vue is the easiest. A part of today's talk was to hopefully show you that Angular is not a scary framework and it's super easy to pick up and get going with. So I don't think that really comes into it, but that is something to consider. And also key elements. Angular is a very structured framework. You get a ton out of the box compared to the other frameworks. It comes default with TypeScript by default instead of having to configure for it or not being able to use it. And you have that LTS, long-term support system, so you know your apps will be supported for a long time. React is very flexible. You only add what you need, so not a lot comes out of the box. So you have to add stuff, but that means that your app is pretty minimalized and you don't have extra stuff in your app that you don't need, like the router, which you usually need. But if you don't need a router, you don't have to import it, whereas Angular, it's in there by default whether you need it or not. Also, React is more towards vanilla JS than either of the other components. Vue, again, tries to take the best of both Angular and React. It's great for small single-page web apps. The big hit you're going to take with it is there's not a lot of American companies that have built large-scale apps with Vue, so there are issues where you won't be able to find your answers on GitHub or Stack Overflow, and you could, for enterprise development, you could run into some big issues. Whereas Angular and React, you're going to find most of the answers that you need on Stack Overflow, and it's a lot easier to find help in terms of that. So that's all that I had to say about Angular versus React versus Vue. I am not, even though I'm an Angular guy myself, I am not a proponent for saying one is better than the other. They all have their pluses and minuses. You can choose what to do, and whatever you choose, you can probably do whatever you need. There is no right answer. I personally like Angular for what you get out of the box, how easy it is to set up and run, and the ease of the CLI, but there is no wrong answer there. And that's all I had to say about Angular. That's the intro. So here are the links. This is the article that I used to fill in some of the knowledge gaps for Angular versus React versus Vue. It's a good article. Check it out. Blog post, excuse me. The Angular Tour of Heroes is a bigger, more in-depth tutorial into Angular. If you're looking to get started, that is the place to go and get a handle on it. The Angular Material website, which is all the components that you can need to know, and Angular CLI, which will show you how to use the CLI and what commands you can use, what components you can generate, and everything you would need to know. And that is the presentation. I hope this was a good intro to Angular for you newbies, and for those of you who are considering using it, I hope I've given you some good reasons to use it. Thank you.